Order. Let me apologize to my fellow senators. You know, I had just gotten back from Iraq, Erbil, Uganda, Rwanda, Ethiopia, Mauritania. Felt fine, but I hit the ground here and I got non-contagious bronchitis. Got that? So anyway, that's why I'm much better today than it was yesterday. Much better, much better. The committee today received testimony on the posture of the Department of the Navy in the fiscal year 2021. We welcome our guest today, the Acting Secretary of the Navy, Tom Modley, Admiral Gilday, Chief of the Naval Operations, and David Berger, Commandant of the Navy. Thanks for coming. Thanks for your long term of service. We appreciate you very much. With the alarming speed of modernization of both conventional and nuclear forces, China and Russia present a credible threat. And I always make reference to this because when we put this together, this was equal Democrats and Republicans as people who no one could question their capabilities. And so we've been trying to follow this. So I'll make several references to this, as will other members. And we did the major thing there is that China and Russia has now passed us in areas that we didn't want to be passed. I'm encouraged by some of our witnesses' public statements and guidance and their subordinates related to reorienting and to great power competition. Thanks to President Trump's leadership, we reset defense spending in 2017, and we are beginning to rebuild the military after many years of neglect, but the hole is deep and the work is just begun. I commend our witnesses for submitting a budget that continues to trend the funding and the readiness accounts that support today's Navy and Marine Corps. However, it is clear to me that the Department of Navy's proposed budget is only sufficient to support a fleet of about 300 ships. That's clearly inadequate to the growing Navy, to the 355, as we find in the manual I just referred to. It's along these lines, I must also point out that the Department has yet to submit a 30-year shipbuilding plan, which by law was required to be submitted to Congress with the budget last month. The absence of this plan makes it impossible to understand how the Department plans to reach its goal and the national policy of a 355-ship Navy. We've got to be smart, not hasty, as we modernize our military. I urge each of you to take a long view. Recent history should be our guide, because without better acquisition performance, we will fall behind, or further behind, I should say, China and Russia. Senator Reid.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I join you in welcoming Acting Secretary Modley and Admiral Gilday and General Berger to the committee this morning to testify of the plans and programs of the Department of the Navy in our review of the fiscal year 2021 authorization request. I particularly want to welcome each of you to your first posture hearing before the committee. We're grateful for your service, for the service of the men and women under your command, and for the support of all the Navy and Marine Corps families. So please express our thanks to these wonderful Americans. As the leaders of the Navy and the Marine Corps, you face significant challenges as you strive to balance the need to support ongoing operations and sustain readiness with the need to modernize and keep the technological edge so critical to military success. In addition, because significant levels of funding are being transferred to build a wall on the southern border, you will have fewer resources for modernization. The Department of the Navy faces serious readiness problems caused by deferred maintenance, reduced steaming and flying hours, and canceled training and deployments. We remember too well the collisions of the McCain and Fitzgerald and the loss of life that resulted. I will be interested in hearing about the progress the Navy is making in continuing to implement changes that will ensure such incidents will not happen again. All areas of our naval forces are maintaining an extremely high operations tempo. Demand is overwhelming for attack submarines, air and missile defense cruisers, destroyers, and strike fighter inventories. The Navy is now in its 8th year operating with fewer than the legally required 11 aircraft carriers. The Ford is listed in the Navy inventory, but that carrier is more than 5 years behind schedule and will not be ready to deploy for many, many months. In addition, during the next decade, the Navy will need to buy the new Columbia-class ballistic missile submarines to replace the Ohio-class submarines. This is an extremely expensive undertaking that is on a very tight schedule. The Navy is using authorities such as multi-year procurement authority to conduct modernization programs more efficiently. Congress has approved multi-year procurement authority for both attack submarines and Aegis destroyers. These vessels represent the largest inventory shortfall compared to the goals in the 2016 Force Structure Assessment, with the actual Navy fleet 15 boats below the attack submarine goal and 14 destroyers below the goal for large service combatants. The Navy just recently signed the multi-year procurement contract for Block 5 of the Virginia-class attack submarine. This contract provides for buying 9 boats for the 5-year period, fiscal year 2019 through fiscal year 2023. The contract also provides an option to buy a 10th boat if the Navy has the resources and the contractors improve performance on the program. Yet the fiscal year 21 budget, which had the best opportunity for funding the 10th boat, did not exercise the option. I am concerned that the window of opportunity for buying a 10th boat could close if funds are not provided to the Navy this year to allow them that opportunity. I see that the #1 item on the CNO's unfunded priority list is funding for the 2nd Virginia-class submarine in fiscal year 21, and I would obviously be interested in your thoughts on this issue. Modernizing ground vehicles remains a priority for the Marine Corps. The amphibious combat vehicle will provide increased force protection and enhanced lethality to our Marines, and it will replace the aging inventory of assault amphibious vehicles. The Marine Corps is also partnering with the Army to develop the Joint Light Tactical Vehicle, or JLTV, to replace the Humvee, and they have made targeted investments in the High Mobility Artillery Rocket System, HIMARS, in order to provide Marines with ground-based indirect fire support. I would welcome an update from our witnesses on how they are balancing the procurement of new systems while upgrading existing platforms to meet current operational needs. In 2016, Admiral Richardson released a force structure assessment that identified a new force structure goal. We had been promised a new force structure assessment by the end of 2019 that would address implementation of the National Defense Strategy, but that has not arrived. I also understand that the Department has not provided the 30-year shipbuilding plan as required by law. I look forward to hearing when the Department will deliver these important documents. Again, I want to thank the witnesses for appearing today, and I look forward to their testimony. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Reed. We'll have opening statements. Your entire statement will be made a part of the record. And we'll start with Admiral Gilday. You're recognized.
Chairman Inhofe, Ranking Member Reed, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear today with Secretary Modly and General Berger. We are thankful for your enduring support of the Navy Marine Corps team. Today, 3 carrier strike groups and 2 amphibious ready groups, along with 30% of our fleet, are deployed forward around the globe. Our Navy Marine Corps team needs no permission to operate at sea, and their power does not rest in any single location, but rather in our ability to maneuver anytime and anywhere the seas reach, operating across the spectrum of military operations. Without question, our sailors remain our most important asset. We have taken a hard look at what they need to be successful, the equipment and the training that they need to fight and win, as well as support required to take care of them and their families. Over the past 8 months, we have engaged in a deep examination of these issues. Our balanced approach and our budget submission this year provides a Navy ready to fight today while committing to the training and the maintenance and the modernization to provide a Navy that's ready to fight tomorrow. Naval power is critical to implementing the National Defense Strategy. But naval power is not just a function of fleet size. It is a combination of the readiness, the lethality, and the capacity of that fleet. Our #1 priority remains the Columbia-class ballistic missile submarine. This request also heavily invests in our readiness accounts, such as ship and aircraft maintenance and modernization, in manpower, in live virtual constructive training, in steaming days, and in flying hours. It invests in new systems to make our fleet more lethal, including increasing our weapons inventory, filling our magazines, bolstering the range and the speed of those weapons, exploring directed energy weapons, and incorporating new technologies like hypersonics. This request grows our fleet in size, generating sustainable, capable capacity. Importantly, naval power is not just determined by what we operate and fight with, but how we operate and fight. We are pursuing an integrated approach with the United States Marine Corps in fleet operations and exercises, in war games, and in experimentation. The net result, we believe, is integrated American naval power. I could not ask for a better partner, a better shipmate in this endeavor than General Berger. Thank you again for your support, which has allowed us to make significant gains in readiness and lethality already. It also allows us to answer our nation's call every day. On behalf of your active duty reserve and civilian sailors and their families who serve our nation, I thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you, Admiral and Secretary Modly. I probably should have started with you, but you're recognized now.
Thank you, Senators. Chairman Inhofe, Ranking Member Reed, distinguished members of this committee, thank you for your bipartisan efforts on behalf of the sailors, Marines, and civilians of the Department of the Navy. It's an honor to be here today with Admiral Gilday and General Berger, both of whom have demonstrated great commitment to each other and to each other's respective naval service as they have worked collaboratively over the last several months to lead our integrated American naval force. Consistent with that spirit, we've taken a different approach to the written testimony this year by submitting one unified document instead of three separate documents, which you've seen. Staying ahead in today's rapidly changing global strategic environment demands that our naval forces commit to unified planning, clear-eyed assessments, and sometimes some very, very hard choices. In this process, we must harmonize competing priorities, sustain our critical industrial base, and not allow our maritime competitive advantage to erode relative to global competitors and, more accurately stated, aggressive adversaries who wish to hasten our decline as a global force for liberty and for decency. In the end, this budget submission is a manifestation of the hard choices we had to make this year, but it's centrally about the safety, security, and well-being of our sailors, Marines, and their families. Ultimately, I ask that you recognize that in this submission we could not make trades that put our sailors and Marines on platforms with equipment that are not ready for a fight, if a fight is what is going to be required of them. While this budget slows our trajectory to a force of 355 or more ships, it does not arrest that trajectory. You have my personal assurance that we are still deeply committed to building that larger, more capable, more distributed naval force within the strategically relevant time frame of no more than 10 years. I look forward to working with this committee and the entire Congress in the coming months as we develop some realistic plans to do that. Our budget also demonstrates a clear commitment to the education of our people as we implement the recommendations of the Education for Sea Power study that I led as the Undersecretary of the Navy for the last 2 years. We are establishing a Naval Community College for our enlisted personnel as part of a bold and unified naval education strategy that recognizes that the intellectual and ethical development of our people is critical to our success as a naval force. We are also stepping up our efforts to meet our solemn commitment to our military families through significantly more engaged oversight and accountability of our public-private venture housing program. Finally, I would like this committee to understand that as leaders of the Department of the Navy, we are both vocal and united in our determination to prevent sexual assault and sexual harassment throughout our force. Every sailor, Marine, and Navy civilian deserve individual respect, dignity, and protection from this great naval institution. We have some work to do in this regard, but you have my personal commitment that we take it very, very seriously. We are grateful to the Congress for passing this year's NDAA, which enables many of the priorities identified within this document. In passing this legislation, you've sent a strong signal of support to our people and a very, very stern warning to our adversaries. We also appreciate the funding stability and the predictability of the last several years. This has saved money for the American taxpayer and given our force the agility and flexibility to address emerging threats while investing in our integrated naval force. We urge the committee to do what it can to continue this stability so that we can implement the reforms and investments required to meet great power challenges, protect the maritime commons, and defend the United States of America. Thank you for your time, and we look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. General Berger.
Chairman Inhofe, Ranking Member Reed, distinguished members of this committee, I appreciate the opportunity to testify on the posture of your Marine Corps and our priorities for the future, and I'm joined by the Sergeant Major of the Marine Corps behind me, Sergeant Major Black, my wife Donna. And I'll start by echoing Secretary Modly and Admiral Gilday's thanks for timely funding, as well as your enduring commitment to the Marines, sailors, and families through efforts like the hurricane recovery, which you authorized, provided for last year, and your revisions and oversight to our work on public-private venture housing program, which the Secretary mentioned. Your bipartisan support is critical to ensure that we continue to prioritize people as our greatest resource. Thanks to predictable funding over the last few years, the Marine Corps has made significant progress restoring both availability and readiness. We are now at an inflection point. We have to pivot now toward modernization while sustaining the readiness that this committee has worked hard to authorize and resource. This pivot, in my opinion, cannot wait until next year or the following. We must move now or risk overmatch in the future by an adversary, and that is a risk we will not take. As the National Defense directs and Secretary Modly recently emphasized in his first vector to all hands, we have to pursue urgent change at a significant scale. Marines have always sensed when it's time to move out smartly. We don't hesitate. This is that time. Realizing the bold direction of our strategic guidance requires acknowledging that there are fundamental changes in the operating environment and how we must organize, train, and equip the force. I'm confident that most leaders recognize that significant change is required, yet the scope and the pace of that change is seemingly at odds with some historical resource allocations and some of our major acquisition programs which predate the National Defense Strategy. This budget submission marks the beginning of a focused effort to better align resources that you provide with strategic objectives. Our future budget submissions will build on those investments with informed recommendations for force design, modifications, and adjustments to our programs of record. Together, in partnership with my battle buddy Admiral Gilday and under the direction of Secretary Modly, we are committed to delivering the integrated naval fleet marine forces your nation requires. As always, I welcome the opportunity to discuss our findings along the way, and we will keep each of you and your staffs informed as we progress. As always, we will be frugal with the resources we are given. We will ask for no more than we need. With Congress's commitment and support, we will ensure that your Marines continue to have every advantage when we send them into harm's way. I look forward to your questions. Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you. I was going to start off with talking about the fact that we don't have the 30-year shipbuilding plan. I'm sure somebody else would do that. There are two things that I wanted to get to, though, and one obviously is would not be unexpected. The USS Gerald Ford. I think most of us around in this table here have been down there, have walked it, understand it, but we're also fully aware that that ship, the original plan to deliver the ship was September of 2015. It was to be, the ship was going to be delivered fully capable at the cost of $10.5 billion. Now the projected full delivery of the ship would be April of 2021, the cost being at $13.2 billion. So, Secretary Modly, today's your lucky day. You get to make an next prediction, and I'd like to have you kind of share with us where you think it is right now. It's my understanding that a lot of the things, it's not just the elevators, we talk about those, but also the catapults, arresting gear, the radar, and understand now that the non-skid situation is taken care of from visiting with you in my office. But kind of go over where we are today, what your predictions are, and when this is going to happen.
Senator, I appreciate the opportunity to talk about the Ford. I think the history that you laid out about the Ford is it's not a good history, and it's one that we should never allow to happen again. It's it's not the way that we should be delivering ships to the U.S. Navy. That being said, we are where we are with that ship, and one of the first things I did is, as the acting secretary, was to basically put the fleet on notice that it's all hands on deck to make that ship ready for sea and ready for a fight if that's what we needed to do. So we've taken several proactive steps over the last several months to get that ship ready. A lot of this work was going on already, but one of the main things we did is we moved the two-star admiral who's responsible for the PEO for all carriers. We moved him to Norfolk to basically be there. It's symbolic, but it's more than symbolic. It requires a lot of attention to detail on many of the things that were lacking on this ship. I've been down there twice since I've been the acting secretary, once as a surprise on my second day, just to see what it's like, and I didn't want any admirals there with me. I walked around, talked to the crew, got a good sense for where the ship was, and I also rode the ship in after their last short deployment where they went out and did aircraft compatibility testing. It has been night and day for me in terms of my perspective and my perception on what's happening with that ship. They've made substantial progress on the elevators. The elevators that are working and certified, I think there are 4 of those. They've done thousands and thousands of cycles with those with no problems. They launched close to 1,000 aircraft and recovered them with no problems on the EMALs either. So significant progress. And the most encouraging thing to me is walking around that ship is talking to the crew. The crew loves the ship. The way the crew and how their jobs have changed, several of them coming from Nimitz-class carrier to this carrier. It's completely changed the way they do their work.
And I understand that. And I also talked to the crew, and it's those are their feelings exactly. I wanted to get one more thing in my time here. In a recent interview, you stated, quote, "I don't know if we're going to buy any more of the Ford class after the CVN 81, which would be the 4th one. We were certainly thinking about the possibility of other classes." Can you elaborate on that statement?
Yes, sir. I think we have a duty to look at what will come after the Ford. And the fact that we made a 2-carrier buy for the last 2, it gives us some breathing room. It gives us a few years before we would have to award the next one, which would be in the 27, 28 time frame.
Okay, that answers the question. General Berger, on the CH-53K, which would be replacing the CH-53E, we're familiar with the cost of this thing and some of the overruns, and I'd kind of like to get an update in this brief period of time from you as to where we are, why it's really necessary, and just give us your opinion on that.
Thank you, sir. The requirement for a heavy lift helicopter remains valid. In fact, probably more valid in the adversaries, the competitors that we need to face, and where you want your forward Marines. You have to have the ability to move that force around and its sustainment from ship to shore or shore to shore or back to ship again. So we have a valid requirement. A year ago, the 53K was in a different spot. We had both technical, as you know, engineering problems and cost problems. Today, much better place engineering-wise, technologically. It looks like a 53E on the outside, but like you know, you pop the hood, it's a completely different aircraft. Everything from the exhaust gas recirculation to the other 100-plus engineering challenges we have either solved or Sikorsky's has a solid path forward. So I'm very confident that the aircraft is on the right trajectory. Now it's a function of cost, as you pointed out, sir. Both procurement and the cost to operate that.
Why does it cost more than an F-35?
Pardon me, sir?
Never mind. No, I was making a comment that costs more than F-35. When you're talking to the general public, they don't know much about they know about the F-35.
Right.
Go ahead.
Yes, sir.
So why does it cost more than an F-35?
It's a brand new fly-by-wire aircraft.
Yeah. Very good. Thank you, Senator Reed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I indicated in my opening comments, the Navy is critically short of attack submarines, 15 below the goal established previously and accepted by the Navy, and all 14 destroyers below that objective. And Admiral Gilday, is there any chance that this demand will lessen over time or increase?
Senator, given the pace of the Chinese right now, I don't think that threat's going to subside. I also think, particularly in the undersea, is where we have an advantage, significant advantage, and so we want to maintain that overmatch. We don't want to take our foot off the pedal.
No, I appreciate that. I think also, too, with respect to Russia, their sophistication undersea is another challenge. It's not just simply numbers. It's also more sophisticated vessels. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, much more sophisticated. And as you know, the capabilities that we're putting into the Virginia-class Block 4s and the Block 5s are significant. They're a significant leap forward for the United States. And so our intention is to continue to press with that technology and improve it.
Now, in the Block 5 buy, there was a 9-ship commitment plus an optional ship. One of the concerns I have is that the window for this option will close very quickly, and that this might be the best year to exercise the option. Can you comment on that? Because I see pressure not only in the construction of the additional Block 5 vessels, but from all we've talked about here before, aircraft carriers, everything else, destroyers. This might be the best year. Is that right?
Yes, sir, I believe so. In terms of the workforce, I was just up in Groton at Electric Boat a week or so ago, and I left that shipyard confident about the capability of that yard to produce boats at the rate of 2 a year. And they are planning for the significant increase of the work when the Columbia build begins in earnest. But that is a passionate, well-trained workforce up there, and I think that they can handle 2 boats a year based on what I've seen.
Thank you very much, Admiral. And Mr. Secretary and Admiral Gilday, the chairman alluded to this issue, but we're still awaiting these 2 significant reports, the force structure assessment and also the shipbuilding plan. Based on Secretary Esper's testimony yesterday, I believe it's at his desk, literally. And is that we're waiting for that, and when will we get it?
Yes, sir. I'm very anxious to get over here and talk that through with the committee. Secretary Esper wanted a little more time to digest it. It's informed by the 21 budget, but also by the integrated force structure assessment that Admiral Gilday and General Berger put together. And I think he just wanted more time to understand it. We will bring it over here as soon as he feels that he's ready to do that. I
think the committee encouraged him to take adequate time, but not a lot of time. So we hope that will be the case. General Berger, you have programs with the Army with respect to the JLTV, the Joint Light Tactical Vehicle. The Army is making some changes in the program. Are you adjusting to them, or how are you adjusting to them, I should ask?
Senator, I'm aware of the adjustments that they're making. We have not made any changes yet to our procurement. And if we did, it would be based on the Marine Corps' needs. But we are absolutely tracking the changes, the adjustments that they're making. So far, sir, I've seen it down in North Carolina where my son is. It's a phenomenal vehicle.
I've had the chance to look at it at the facility, and it is a much more significantly, well, it's a good vehicle. I'll stop right there. Secretary Moley, the committee in the last few years have created the National Sea-Based Deterrence Fund because we understand the industrial base is significant, and there are problems with the industrial base for every type of platform. And we think that by going into the industrial base through the prime contractors, not only can we increase quality, protect from cyber intrusion, but also generate savings from doing the work right the first time. Can you just briefly comment? And I don't have much time.
No, Senator, I agree. We've had some vulnerabilities in the supply chain across the entire Navy. It's a vulnerability that our adversaries have figured out. That's easy for them to get in, and they can piece information together, and they get a bigger picture, even when a supplier may think that small piece of information is not relevant. So we are investing heavily in this. We are developing new strategies for how we do this, how perhaps we develop capabilities to perhaps create cloud areas for them that are secure. But it's a big concern of ours, and we're addressing it.
In addition to that, the simple fact of quality construction at the sub prevents rework at the prime.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Wicker.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the service of all three of you. I know you've had to deal with a budget number that you did not arrive at yourselves, and I appreciate you doing a difficult task. We hope we can use our power of the purse here in this committee and in the Congress to help you out on that. I think Ranking Member Reed expressed, with regard to the 30-year shipbuilding plan, the sentiment of most people on this committee that the Secretary should take enough time but not too much time. So I want to subscribe my views to what he said about that. And Admiral Gilday, with regard to the submarines, let me make sure. You said that the threat will not diminish. Actually, the threat is increasing, and and you nodded, but that is correct, right?
Yes, sir. I agree.
And that is not only with regard to the specific question, Admiral, that Senator Reed asked about submarines, but it's actually across the entire fleet. Is that correct?
I would agree with that as well, sir.
All right. Thank you very, very much. And appreciate the fact that the NDAA tasked the Navy last year to review alternative acquisition strategies. The Navy came back with a report that said significant savings could be achieved by procuring various combinations of amphibious ships. So let me ask you, Secretary Modly, and General Berger, about these findings, particularly as they're related to the 3 LPDs and the LHA-9. Can you speak to the timeline for awarding the funding of these ships, and what are the benefits of procuring these 4 ships together? And let me just get all my questions out there, and we'll see what we can do in less than 3 minutes. What are the specific capabilities, and what is the specific importance, General Berger, of the amphibious ships that I mentioned?
Sir, the amphibious ships, capabilities-wise, in the past, pretty conventional view of what they did in terms of the Navy, the force, projecting the Marines ashore. And the way that we're going to need to operate in the future, even more challenging, and the role of the amphibious ship, I think, goes up. Why? Because in order to operate a force inside a contested area at the unclassed level, inside there, you've got to have the mobility, and you need the ability to sustain that force for a long period of time in austere conditions and move that force around. Amphibious ships are, people have spoke of them as sort of the Swiss Army knife. They are. Because you can move a force from the air, on the water. You got multiple means to do the job. So I think their value to the naval force, their value to the joint force goes up in the future.
And with respect to sort of the business considerations, Senator, we're looking at all types of options to be able to bundle our buys of ships in order to drive down the cost, provide more stability to the industrial base and that supplier base, which extends far beyond just the shipyards that are doing the primary construction. So I talked to Secretary Gertz about this morning, about how we might be doing this, particularly in the amphib area, and we're going to be thinking about that and developing some plans to do that.
Okay, and then specifically, the U.S. currently has 4 DDGs based in Rota, Spain. These platforms provide an advanced multi-mission defense capability. I think we're getting the right testimony with regard to the need there. Do we need the 2 additional DDGs in Rota, Spain, and tell us about the plans to accomplish that?
Senator, we support the 2 additional DDGs to Spain. Right now, we're working with U.S. European Command. They are putting together their strategic laydown of the theater. So when that is complete, you'll be briefed up here in the Congress. And then in parallel, we'll be moving through the Office of the Secretary of the Navy and then the Office of the Secretary of Defense coordinating with the Department of State, and then finally the government of Spain, so they can line everything up to get additional DDGs over at some point to Rota. But we're very supportive right now. Our assessment is that the Spanish want us there in greater numbers, and certainly the commander of U.S. European Command does.
And just briefly, General Walters has testified that we actually have the infrastructure there at Rota that is able at this point to house the 2 additional destroyers. Is that correct, Admiral?
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much.
Senator Blumenthal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here, for your service, and thank you, General Berger, for your wife's presence here today. Donna's presence, I think, points to the importance of our military families and the service and sacrifice that they make so that we can be the greatest and strongest military force in the world. And in that connection, I'd just like to mention, I didn't have a chance to question General Milley or Secretary Esper yesterday about the Tenant Bill of Rights for military housing, which, frankly, is somewhat mystifying to me in failing to set forth 3 of the essential rights that we incorporated in the NDAA last year. And I want to emphasize again the importance of military housing and raising it to the standards that we think are important. I'm going to be submitting questions in writing to them. I don't want to take time on it this morning, but any responses in writing you have on that issue, I would certainly welcome. General Berger, I appreciated your response to Senator Inhofe about the CH-53K, and I agree with you totally on the importance of this aircraft. In fact, as you may know, today literally marks the birthday of Connecticut Sikorsky Engineering, which was established in March 5, 1923. It's provided 97 years of capability for our nation's defense, including the CH-53K, which is a marvel of engineering. And I want to suggest that the cost of each aircraft would come down if the pace of production is increased. If we go from 7 to 9, which I would advocate, the cost per copy would come down. Would you agree with that point?
I would agree with the math, yes, sir.
Thank you. Admiral Gilday, I want to thank you for your visit to Groton, which was enormously meaningful and inspiring, and your very insightful questions, and I agree with you completely that we have one of the great, passionate, dedicated workforces in any engineering facility there at Groton. But I'm deeply concerned by the graph that you and I saw of the worker demands, the production and employment capabilities that we're going to see, and the troughs, the deep dips in employment, and particularly during 23 to 24, 2023 to 24. I would like to know what the Navy can do to mitigate those troughs. I know that time won't permit you to give a full answer, but I'm going to ask for a full briefing. I asked for the charts and some of the underlying data while we were there, and I wonder if you could respond to that point.
Yes, I'd just say with the lack of an additional submarine in FY21, what we would do, and we are doing right now, is to take a look with Electric Boat at how we might be able to put some of their workforce that would otherwise potentially be furloughed to work, whether that be at Portsmouth, New Hampshire, in our facility up there, or down in Newport News, Virginia. And so I will tell you this, that we believe that the defense industrial base, particularly the work that's being done with ships and submarines, is absolutely the crown jewel in the defense industrial base. And so we want to work very closely to make sure that we don't hit a trough that we can't recover from quickly, because that industry just is not very elastic. And so we've lived through this before, and we have to be more responsive.
Well, as you know, there's been a furlough of about 300 workers in the last few months,
sure,
but that is minuscule compared to the thousands that we will see going down and then
coming back in terms of the demands on that workforce. So the lack of that second submarine in 2021 is really going to be impactful. You're absolutely right. It is the crown jewel. And I think we are really playing with fire if we fail to make sure that workforce is sustained.
Sure.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen. General Berger, I want to return to the chairman's question about the 53 kilo. Given its costs, can you just tell us in a little more detail what is the long-term outlook for this helicopter?
So our program of record is 200 aircraft. That's our requirement. And the two costs, as most folks in here are really well aware of, are the APUC, the individual cost up front, and then the flyaway recurring cost. The math, as outlined accurately before, when we get on schedule for a buy and the learning curve continues up, then the cost starts to come down. But we have to close that gap because I owe you an honest answer that this is an aircraft that we can afford. This is an aircraft that we can sustain over the lifespan of it. So far, again, the engineering part, I'm very, very comfortable with. Now it's a function of making sure, closing the gap to where I can convince you that this is the best use of our resources for an aircraft we definitely need.
So you're saying that you owe us an answer and you need to convince us. It doesn't sound like you are yet fully convinced yourself.
I think there's room still to close the gap, and Sikorsky agrees as well. The learning that happens on the first of anything, of course, they're going to drive down the cost just because they're going to produce it more efficiently, and the engineering costs that are going to the first batch of research and engineering models is going to go down.
When do you think we might
get
that
yes, sir.
answer?
The next contract is due to be awarded, I think, in the August, September timeframe. We'll know then.
Okay. I want to turn to another item that was in the President's budget request, which I found interesting. You are going to buy Tomahawk missiles this year. Specifically, I see the Marine Corps in FY19 asked for 0 Tomahawk missiles. And in FY20, you asked for 0 Tomahawk missiles. And in FY21, you have requested 48 Tomahawk missiles. I presume you're not planning to launch those off any of your amphibious ships. So could you tell us what you plan to do with those 48 Tomahawk missiles?
Yes, sir. Part of the homework that the Navy and Marine Corps have done over the past 6 months is how we think we're going to need to operate in the future as an integrated naval force. And that means the Marine Corps assumes a role which we have not had in the past 20 years, which is how do we contribute to sea control and sea denial? The Tomahawk missile is one of the tools that's going to allow us to do that. Now, it's much like the MQ-9 Reaper for us, it could be the answer, it could be the first step towards a longer-term answer 5, 6, 7 years from now. But what we need is long-range precision fires for a small unit, a series of units that can, from ship or from shore, hold an adversary's naval force at risk. And that missile is going to help us do that.
And is it safe to say that this decision is a result of our withdrawal from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, that you can explore these options?
I would assume so. I hadn't linked the two together. We just knew we need a long-range precision fires beyond the range that we were restricted to before, yes.
And most particularly in the Western Pacific, given China's long-range precision fires, since they were never a party to the INF Treaty?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. I'm glad to see that you're exploring those options. I'm sure a lot of your Marines would think it would be awesome if you launched them from amphibious ships, but probably not what you have in mind. But obviously, we face a pretty significant firepower gap in the Western Pacific, given China's stockpiling of thousands of missiles, and it's good to see your service beginning to address that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, in a hearing like this, you always get comments and questions about things that are left out. I want to start with a compliment, the fact that you've increased the R&D budget, because we're in not only a a competition of forces and ships and troops, but a competition of innovation. And if we're going to stay ahead in terms of the technology of future conflicts, R&D is going to be critical. Directed energy, I think, is an enormously important potential part of our naval force. Hypersonics we've discussed, and I think that's something we're going to be discussing, or I'm going to be talking with Admiral, with you and your staff in a classified setting. Unmanned craft, I mean, there's just a lot of new technology that has to be developed over the next several years, and I compliment the Secretary and the Department for putting some emphasis on R&D and innovation. Now, for the other side of the coin, I'm concerned that we're talking about trying to get to a 350-ship Navy, or actually, Mr. Secretary, I think you've talked about a 390-ship Navy. And we're also talking about developing a new large surface combatant. And yet, in the new fit-up, we're losing 4 destroyers, which are sort of the workhorse of the surface combatants. And I'm worried about a gap. I'm worried about a fall off in not only in shipbuilding, but in the industrial base. Can you speak to that concern?
Senator, thanks for the question. I think one of the problems we have this year is we have sort of a confluence of bad timing on a lot of different things. We started on this integrated force structure assessment last summer. It was delivered to me in January, and it sort of came to me after we had already completed most of the work on the 21 budget submission. So what we found in this force structure assessment is that there's a demand for a 355 plus type of scenario.
And part of that 355 are large surface combatants.
Yes, they are.
Like DDGs.
Yes, they are. Yes, they are. Most of everything that we have right now is going to be part of it, but there are new things that General Berger alluded to, a new smaller amphib, new smaller combat support vessel that can help support distributed maritime operations. Of course, the new frigate will be a key element of that strategy and in that new force structure. And then unmanned platforms, both undersea and above the surface, or on the surface, will be part of that future force mix. We're just in the process of trying to educate and help the Secretary understand what this might mean, and then we will move out with a strategy for how we get there. That's a challenge for us. But in any scenario, we're talking about a significant expansion in the size of the fleet, and we're looking at a flat top line. And those two, that mathematical equation is difficult for us to bridge.
Well, one of the problems is that we're trying to recapitalize through operating budgets. Any other business in the world would say a 40-year asset like a Columbia-class submarine is a capital investment as opposed to a drain on current operating cash flow. And yet, that it's the bulge in the process of the modernization and the rebuilding of the nuclear deterrent that's really causing a lot of this squeeze, as I see. Admiral, do you agree with that assessment?
Yes, sir, I do. The Secretary's challenged us with finding $8 billion this year in our existing budget so that we can put that towards not only shipbuilding, but all the other pillars that support it, the manpower, the weapons, the training, et cetera, so that we can increase our numbers. With respect to the legacy ships that we're looking at decommissioning, it becomes we get to a point, sir, where the return on investment, we're just not going to get the return with respect to lethality. And so some of these hulls are over 30 years old. And so numbers are important, but in the end, we'd rather have a ready, capable, lethal fleet.
Of course.
Over a larger.
Lethality is the measure, not absolute numbers. I understand that.
Correct.
By the way, if you're talking about decommissioning ships, give them a few more years and send them to the Caribbean and the Pacific, where we can interdict some of these drug shipments. We are now interdicting 25% of the drug shipments we know of, and 75% are going by even though we know they're there because of a lack of assets. So if you got spare ships, Admiral, I know where you might want to send them.
Sir, we are sending ships to Southern Command and in discussions right now about what those numbers ought to look like. In fact, we're deploying 2 littoral combat ships this year.
Because that's a war we're in right now, and Americans are dying in that war.
Yes, sir.
And I sincerely hope you and Southcom and Coast Guard can really get together make a dent in that traffic. I'm out of time, General, but perhaps for the record, you could give me your thinking on the reduction of your end strength by 2,100 Marines, given the demands on the Marine Corps. So I'll look for that for you. Thank you. Thank you very, very much, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you for your service. General Berger, there have been reports that the Secretary of Defense will move the Close Combat Lethality Task Force from an element that directly reports to him to one that reports to the Army. This is an organization that is examining the full range of capabilities, from material solutions to physiological performance to improving policies, in order to provide the overmatch to the 4% of the members of the Joint Force who have experienced 90% of our combat deaths since the end of the Second World War. This is obviously a joint problem, one that the Army, Special Forces, or Special Operations Command, and the Marines need to have full visibility on, and where solutions need to be joint and department-wide. Can you provide me with your best professional military advice on what about this move could work and what about this might not work for the Marine Corps?
Sir, I'm very familiar with it. When it was initially stood up, and since it was run by a retired Marine colonel who I know really well from Fallujah, Iraq. So for the Marine Corps, we have been involved in the task force from day one and still are. So the move to shift it into the Army, I'm not concerned about. We work laterally on a lot of programs like the Joint Light Tactical Vehicle. It's not an issue at all. But parking it in a service is a good thing because they know how to run a program, they know how to resource it, and there's great working relationships between services already. We remain tied in on that task force. We have Marines as part of that task force within the Army now. That'll continue for all the reasons that you said. That's where the casualties occur.
Thank you, General. Today, in the way that we fight our wars, the electromagnetic spectrum is essential in terms of how we do battle. And we use multiple parts of the spectrum. Specifically, and I want to refer to the Secretary's HASC testimony on February 26th. Secretary Esper said that the DOD is willing to share, and I emphasize share, spectrum with 5G networks in the mid-band range of 3 to 4.2 gigahertz. Secretary Modly, what systems does the Navy have that might be affected, and how could sharing that spectrum space impact Homeland Defense? And I'd like to specifically point out we're talking about sharing and not vacating that space.
Well, Senator, it would have a profound impact on our Aegis system. And, of course, we cannot abandon that spectrum. It would have profound negative implications for that system. So, as the Secretary stated, we're willing to share it, but we have to be very protective of that because it is critical to our ability to defend ourselves as a nation.
Thank you. Admiral Gilday?
Sir, I have nothing more to add to the Secretary's comments. I completely agree that we need to protect that portion of the spectrum for Aegis for Homeland Defense.
Thank you. Let me go back a little bit and talk about submarines.
Sure.
We've talked about building new submarines. I'd like an update, if I could get it, with regard to the mid-year refueling or the midlife refueling on the submarines, the nuclear attack submarines that we have right now. I'm going to point out, and I've done this in the past, we're talking about the USS Boise. And now I understand there are 3 more that are waiting at dock to be able to sequence into dry dock to be actually refueled and made available for service again. The need, I believe, is still there, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but with these particular submarines, we still want them. This could mean that the USS Boise may very well have been out of service for a period of 8 years waiting for refueling before it's back in operation again. Can you tell me what we're doing to expedite the process to bring these submarines back on and where we're at in that process?
Sir, we're going to begin maintenance on Boise this May, and then we'll get under contract for her extended maintenance. At the time that these decisions were made on Boise, we had a capacity issue in our public yards, and so we started to then send some of that work to private yards. We're now at the point, and I know you're aware of this, in the public yards, we've increased that workforce by 10,000 workers in the past 10 years. And so 4,000 in the last 3 years, I think. And so we have that capacity back. We're actually taking one of our availabilities from a private yard and now moving it back into the public yard. I don't want to imply that we're out of the woods yet and we're watching it very closely. I think we're in a better place now than we were 2 and 3 years ago.
We'll be able to, if I could say, we won't have the same problem with the next 3 in line that we had with the Boise?
Don't anticipate it, sir, but I will go back and take a look, and we will brief you in more detail on what that lineup looks like and any challenges that we think we may face.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, I want to thank you for visiting Hawaii, and I especially would like to thank your wife for the time that she spent with the family of the people who were shot at the shipyard and also the survivor. Please extend my thanks to her. Over the past few weeks, I have met with several of your colleagues, including Assistant Secretary Gertz. In fact, that was only 2 days ago, I think, or yesterday, to discuss the importance of modernizing our shipyards. And of course, the delay in repair and all of that was just touched upon by Admiral. So I can't overemphasize the importance of us continuing to go through with the modernization plan. And just to let everybody know, the Pearl Harbor Shipyard, which is one of the 4 public shipyards in our country, and Pearl Harbor contributes nearly $1 billion to Hawaii's economy every year and employs close to 6,500 personnel, including nearly 1,000 engineers. It is the largest employer of its kind in Hawaii. And due to the current inefficient arrangement at the shipyard, it is necessary that the optimization plan be implemented to provide much needed updates. And so I know you are very well aware we need a new dry dock and a production facility. Funding the critical shipyard modernization program will require a significant portion of the Navy's budget. Does the Navy's fiscal year 2021 budget fully fund this shipyard modernization plan so that it will be implemented on time? And I'm talking about the 4 shipyards, not just the one in Hawaii.
Yes, Senator. This is a high priority for us in the Navy, and it is a 20-year commitment of $23 billion, I believe, over 20 years. So as long as we're here, we'll continue to push for this. We're sequencing in the work in the most logical possible way that we can to address the things that you mentioned, which is how the work flows through the shipyard. So we ensure that we don't do work now that then we're going to have to take out as part of the longer-term strategy. So yes, it's funded. I believe we're spending almost $600 million on this year, and that will continue.
Is $600 million enough to keep to the timelines that we have for the modernization program?
I believe it is. I believe it is. I think when we looked at this and we thought about the work and how we would push it through the 4 different yards, it made sense to do it in this way. Obviously, we'd love to have more, to be able to do more, but we also had to think about how we don't disrupt the current work that's in there at the same time.
And of course, in Hawaii, I'd like to see some concrete actually being poured for the dry dock and the production facility sometime soon. Mr. Secretary, in conversations that I've had with subcontractors that support our shipbuilding programs, I've heard that the guidance associated with the Cybersecurity Maturity Modernization Certification, CMMC, has been somewhat confusing, making it difficult for businesses and contractors to comply. What can you tell me about the current state of the CMMC framework? And I'm told by the subs that there are changing requirements that come down the pike, and they do their best to try and comply. But with regard to the new one, which is the CMMC, what timelines are in place for educating, certifying, and auditing our defense industrial base, keeping in mind that there are thousands of suppliers, and I assume that all of them need to provide certification regarding the security requirements?
Yes, Senator, that's a great question. If you allow me to get you specifics on where we are in the implementation to that, I will do that. We've elevated our cyber security awareness to the highest levels in the department with a new office there. I'm sure they're monitoring this, and I can get you specific details. We understand there's pushback from the supplier base, particularly the smaller subs who see this as an additional cost for them, and we're trying to figure out ways that we can help them perhaps create some shared services for them that they could use at that level. But let me get you a specific answer.
I think that's really important because we have literally, as I said, thousands and thousands of suppliers, and there's always that weak link possibility if we don't provide them with the kind of support they need to comply. Last week, Admiral Aquilino, he's the commander of PAC Fleet, issued guidance instructing Navy vessels departing from port visits to remain at sea for at least 14 days before pulling into another port in order to monitor sailors for coronavirus symptoms. And this week, the 6th Fleet followed suit. How is the Navy preparing for coronavirus, and how do you anticipate that the virus will impact the Navy's ability to operate overseas? Admiral?
Senator, we're following the department's guidance, which essentially tries to minimize contact, particularly in those areas where there's a heavy concentration of coronavirus, and it manifests in different ways in different geographic locations. Mm-hmm. We're receiving excellent reporting from the World Health Organization through to CDC and down to the department on specific areas. Italy and Bahrain are really good examples. The Korean Peninsula is another good example. And so we're trying to be preemptive and preventative in terms of limiting numbers of large gatherings, as an example. Mm-hmm. On a day-to-day basis, we're making decisions on closing DoD schools based on what we're seeing in terms of caseloads at local hospitals. All of our medical personnel have been trained in the symptoms, and if they suspect that somebody does have corona, we test for it, and then we send that off to a lab to be confirmed. But we also quarantine those people and their families until we ascertain whether or not they're actually infected.
Do you have test kits?
No, we don't. We don't yet, but that's not just a problem for DoD. But I think that we're getting to a better place in terms of the production to allow us to be able to distribute those out to the force.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for your indulgence in allowing me to go over, and I do have some other questions for the record. Thank you.
Thanks for asking.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, gentlemen, very much for being here today. And Secretary, I'll start with you. Many businesses across America depend on predictable shipbuilding requirements to maintain a trained workforce and develop manufacturing lines. And you are probably not surprised to learn that in Iowa, we do not build ships. We do not. But my landlocked home state of Iowa is part of the Navy's inventory and pipeline of talent. And Carver Pump, which I love to highlight, Carver Pump and its team of 110 hardworking Iowans supply pumps to almost every Navy ship in the active fleet, and they are being installed in many ships currently in production. And in total, Iowa is home to 8 submarine industrial base suppliers. So we are very proud of that. While we're not providing the end product, the finished ship, we do have those suppliers. And so I do understand that the Navy must utilize its funds and invest in assets that reflect the NDS of today. The goal is to modernize our fleet. How are those conversations going with industry to ensure that their production capabilities can meet the requirements in this new era of great power competition?
Well, we have an amazing supplier base in the country, but it is under pressure to some extent, and so we have to ensure that we're maintaining a steady flow of work through them. The carrier program alone, if you look at the Ford program right now, employs over almost 60,000 people across the United States in 46 different states. And so when you think about a program like that, and not just the employment, but the type of employment, this is all high technology. We're bringing in workers, young people, training them in a trade that they can continue to contribute to this process over time. And so we have to be really, really careful when we talk about decisions in this space, because it is that national asset that they create is the ship that we see. But the national asset they contribute to is the national asset of manufacturing capability and high technology that exists in the country that follows them. So we have to continue to worry about that and think about it. When I go out and speak to industry, what I find more often is that I find businesses that are not currently doing defense work that are really interested in doing defense work. Mm-hmm. And absolutely. How do we make it easier for them to do that? And so we're working on that.
Right, absolutely, and I do appreciate that. And we look at examples like the Ford. We get very concerned about that because as members of Congress, we are watching those taxpayer dollars. So we are reliant on industry as well to make the recommendations to make sure we're producing the necessary requirements for our fleet, but get it out in a timely manner, and on time, on target is always best. But always having those discussions with industry is important, so thank you for that. We're all familiar as well, Mr. Secretary, with this committee's concern for the health and well-being of all of our service members. And last year, when Congress passed the NDAA for fiscal year 20, we included a provision that directed the Department of Defense to document blast exposure history in the medical record of all service members. And we've made significant improvements in this area on how we are treating, documenting, and understanding the effects and causes of traumatic brain injuries. The progress is encouraging. We still have more that we can do, and where we can potentially negate the impact of TBIs. And can you maybe explain to this committee what the Department of the Navy and the Marine Corps is doing to improve the understanding and prevention of traumatic brain injuries, and specifically those coming from blast injuries?
Yeah, ma'am, I can say that of the about 80% of the TBI injuries that we see are off-duty related, and because we benefited, military medicine has benefited greatly from what we've experienced from Iraq and Afghanistan. So we're able to return about 85% of those sailors back to work, just based on the high proficiency of our medical teams.
Very good. I know that in SOF, we are actively baselining many of their members, which is something that we would love to do across the conventional forces as well. General Berger, would you like to address it, please?
Just three quick parts to that. First, the protect part, the equipment that we wear, the vehicles, the aircraft. A lot of improvement over the last 3 or 4 years. We have a lot of room still to go there. Second is the detection part, which you mentioned, really difficult, which relies wholly on baseline up front, which we do as well. All of us who've been to Iraq and Afghanistan the last 6, 7 years, all baseline. We did not do that the first deployment. I was not either. Have to do that because you can't measure any change from that. And the last part is the treatment, which the CNO mentioned, and it can't stop initially. This is an enduring. The impact of that could be lifelong. So it's different than some other ailments, some other issues that we have. We have to treat it as a long-term issue.
Yeah, thank you very much. And General Berger, you're spot on. It does create complications further down the road, especially if we're not treating that TBI. So thank you, gentlemen, very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, the witnesses, for being here today and for your service. Secretary Modly, I want to ask you about the frigate. You mentioned the frigate as a key element in our future ship fleets. Can you give us an idea? I've got folks down at Austell down in Alabama trying to put together a great design and compete for that contract, but it seems that the process timeline's been a little bit of a moving target. Can you tell us right now where we are in that process and the timeline for the frigate contract award?
Senator, thanks for the question. The plan had been to award the contract sometime in the latter half of this fiscal year. I've asked Secretary Gertz to look at possibly pulling that forward if everything's done properly and everything is thoroughly vetted and evaluated, and so he's looking into that. So there is some possibility that we may pull that award a little bit sooner.
All right. Could you let me know if that is the case?
Yes, sir.
I noticed in the FIDAP that it includes only 9 frigates, although originally there were going to be 10 in the first block. Does this mean that the total ship procurement is being reduced, or just the procurement timeline?
No, sir. I think that this is part of the discussion that we've been talking about earlier about the new integrated force structure assessment and how the frigate plays in that. Based on current plans and current thinking, this is where we are. But I anticipate as we look at this in more depth and the Secretary of Defense can get comfortable with it, we're going to look at ways to possibly purchase more of these over time. But right now, that's sort of where we are in terms of our thinking.
Okay, so the total numbers haven't changed just in this first block. Is that a fair statement?
No, sir, nothing's changed in that.
Okay, all right, thank you. Sticking with Austal for a minute, I'd like to talk a little bit about the Expeditionary Fast Transport, the EPF. Can you give me an idea, Admiral Gilday, where those are being used and how they're being used right now, the EPFs?
So those ships are great. We put adaptive force packages on them, and so some of them are highly classified missions. Others are to move troops or we just used two in an exercise called Pacific Partnership in Indo-Pacific, where we use them for humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. And the two that we have in the budget, what we're trying to do with those ships is to give them a medical capability where they actually have a 750 room hospital as well as 12 operating rooms. And so because of the cubic foot space that you have in those ships, you can really do a lot with them, including their flight deck.
All right, well, I'm asking because you've got two in this budget, but the president just took away one that was set to be awarded, I think, in April of this year as a $260 million contract again for, I'm curious as to if that particular ship could have been used the same way. Why was it taken out?
Sir, I can't tell you directly why it was taken out. I know that those decisions were made at a higher level based on priorities, strategic priorities, and so I just don't have the direct answer for you on the why.
All right, I may submit a question because Secretary Esper's answer was just not satisfactory yesterday, especially in light of your testimony today. And I want to emphasize again, I just think taking the funds away from our sailors, soldiers, and airmen is just wrong. It hurts our men and women in uniform, and it quite frankly hurts my community in Mobile, where we're taking away that because we've got a lot of folks down there that are dependent on Austal and the ships that they build. Secretary Modly, let me just ask you real quick. When you talk about, you mentioned last week, I want to just talk about the 355 main ships may no longer be the right number for our force. And you mentioned that it could be as high as 390. Can you kind of give me some ideas of where all this is coming from and how you're making those assessments and what you're looking for?
Well, sir, it's strategy-based. It's based on the threat, what we see the threat that's emerging, how we would want to counter that threat, not just in terms of a warfighting scenario, but in terms of deterrence and presence. And so that's what's driving it. What's driving the change in the numbers is some of the things that I mentioned earlier in terms of the requirement for a new, smaller amphib, a new combat support vessel as well, possibly more frigates, as you mentioned earlier. That's where sort of the numbers are elevating when we start looking at the difference between this and the 2016 assessment.
All right, are we going to be able to see that 30-year shipbuilding plan and force structure assessment pretty soon?
I hope so, sir.
All right.
I've seen it. I just need to make sure the Secretary of Defense is comfortable with it.
Well, I would encourage you to try to get that to us as soon as possible, please. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here. You know, these concerns about and the wringing of the hands about this budget would have a whole lot more credibility if we'd heard that when the 3 times in the last 50 years we had 3 presidents in the late 70s and the mid-90s and just recently cut our military spending by 25%. That's what this is about today. We're trying to recover. You've done a marvelous job in the Navy and the Marines getting our readiness back. I want to commend you guys for that. Today I want to talk about shipbuilding. When we get this budget, we're supposed to get a shipbuilding plan. Secretary Modly, when should we expect that?
Sir, I'm hoping to get it over here as soon as possible, but frankly, it's not my call. I'm waiting for the Secretary of Defense to allow us to bring it over.
Admiral Gilday yesterday, as a matter of fact, did a great job explaining his requirements, Admiral. He talked about 4 priorities: Columbia class, readiness recovery, lethality, and capabilities we can afford. I respect that. The question, and I want to highlight the NDS. The 355 ship number was developed in 2016. Prior to the NDS, is the 355 number consistent with the NDS requirements put on Navy and Marines?
It's low, sir. So So
An honest man. Thank you, sir.
The short answer, so since the time that assessment has been done, and if you consider the fact that we're integrating much more closely with the Marine Corps and within the Joint Force, you have to consider not only what we're going to fight with, the capabilities, but also how we're going to fight. And so that's translated against a threat that has increasing capability into a larger number of ships, a larger number of more capable lethal ships.
So it has to do with several things, right? What's your responsibility against emerging threats? You said that. What's how are you going to fight the force, and then what kind of lethality you have? So you're working on now that we're not hamstrung by INF. We know that China has they outstick us today. Is that fair?
In some areas, sir,
Okay.
yes.
Secondly, they have about 350 boats today to our 296 by my math. I think that's correct directionally.
Yes, sir.
If you look at what they've said publicly, by 2030 they'll have 425, and if that same gradient goes out by 2034, which is our planning period behind the current shipbuilding plan, we would be at 355 by 2034. That's the 2016 plan. That may change in the current shipbuilding plan, I understand. But by my that we have an 80 boat shortage right now, and we have responsibilities in multiple AORs. They pretty much have one. Are you concerned that our shipbuilding plan is not going to be able to do what we need to do over that 15-year period, particularly against the buildup that we see China? They've deployed more boats in the last 30 months than they have in the last 30 years. So we see their activity. They're telling us what they're doing.
Yes, sir. So simply, it really comes down to our top line, right? And that's our biggest constraint in terms of growing a bigger Navy. Since I've been in uniform, the size of the United States Navy has been dwindling. Over the last few years, we've come up in numbers a bit, but not a lot. And so we believe, based on the NDS and for all the reasons we just stated, that it's time to reinvest in the naval force.
Well, and it'd be one thing if we could fund it. What I'm worried about, and let's take submarines, for example. Your number one priority is Columbia class. I'm proud that Georgia hosts one of the two nuclear bases that hosts those. But we've lost in the last decade, 17,000 vendors, submarine vendors, down to 3,000 vendors. Even if we were to push the money toward this goal to get to where we need to be, can we rebuild the supply chain fast enough to accommodate that?
Sir, based on what we know, we think we can. Based on what we're projecting in terms of submarines, as an example, in terms of what we're procuring, that vendor infrastructure is in place to support that.
Can I move on to one other thing? The Air Force is developing ABMS right now, and that looks like they've had one demonstration across the services. I think there's another one coming up in April. How involved is the Navy in looking at this from the service needs as well as the data that the Navy will be creating? Obviously, as I understand this is a very classified development. Can you give us an update about the Navy's involvement, the Marines' involvement on that?
Sir, so the problem set is that we have netted weapons and we have netted platforms and netted C2 nodes, but we don't have a net, right? And so all the services have come together under a concept called Joint All-Domain C2. So, and we're putting heat on it, a Manhattan Project-like effort, so that we're not delivering this in the mid-2030s, but in the 2020s. All the Joint Chiefs are flying out to Nellis in early April to take a look at this together to make sure we understand how we're going to get after it. It's a priority.
Thank you so much. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Chairman. Secretary Modly and Admiral Gilday, I am quite encouraged to see the priority that the Navy continues to place on hypersonic weapons. As you know, Sandia National Lab has played a critical role in developing this technology over a number of years now. How would you characterize the combined Navy and inter-service effort to transition hypersonic glide bodies out of the labs?
Well, thank you for that question. I actually was in Sandia a few months ago and got to see what they're doing out there, and it's really amazing work. And I'm actually very encouraged about the fact that we're working together with the Air Force and the Army on this, because it is an expensive proposition, and we need to pool our resources and our brain power to get after it. So I think that the progress is good. We significantly asked for a significant step up in funding this year in order to do this. As I look at the test schedule, it looks aggressive, but I think it's doable. So that's probably all that I can talk about in an open
In this
forum.
environment.
We'd be more than happy to come over and have our team brief you on how we're doing on that.
Would there be value in co-locating the development and the production of those capabilities so that we could fully leverage synergies, expertise, and frankly, shorten the feedback loop in that transition from development to production?
Well, I think anything that we can do that can accelerate the process of getting these fielded would be important. I think one of the biggest challenges we have right now is it's not the technology and how to develop these missiles, but it's the production. How do we get this into scale over time? And that is a challenge because we don't have an industrial base that can really do that right now. So we're looking at ways that we can help accelerate that through some incentives, et cetera, to put some funding out there so that we can accelerate the creation of the industrial capacity to produce at scale.
Well, I hope you'll consider us a partner in that effort. I want to switch gears now to the Navy has been conducting live fire tests of its experimental electromagnetic railgun at White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico over the past year. But the FY21 budget includes pretty minimal funding for this capability. What's the Navy's plan to continue developing this program and, for that matter, to mount it on a ship for at-sea testing as well? Admiral?
Yes, sir. So the testing's going rather well. What I'd like to do, sir, is come back to you in a classified setting and talk to you in more detail about where we are with that and where we want to go.
Okay. Do you can you in this setting can you comment on the resourcing in this particular budget?
Sir, the resourcing right now we think is adequate based on the amount of effort that we have ongoing. Okay. So we saw more money in the budget last year based on what we needed to do in terms of R&D, but we're more of a steady state at the moment.
Okay.
Going into 21.
Let's talk Columbia class for a moment. I think this committee understands the importance of that modernization to the nuclear triad. What are your contingency plans if the Navy does not make the already very tight timeline for Columbia, and where would you accept risk?
Sir, that would be best handled in a classified setting. I will say that we've had those discussions with the Secretary of Defense, and you can't just consider one leg. You have to consider the triad and how you'd balance risk across that triad based on challenges you'd face in the modernization efforts across each of those legs. We are having those discussions, sir.
Okay. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you for being here and for your service. General Berger, I'll ask you just one detailed question. I got a few others hopefully I'll have time to get to. With some of the military construction money, I think it was somewhere around $40 million affecting Camp Lejeune as a result of the executive order. I understand there were two projects down there that have been pushed somewhat to the right. Can you give me the current status of those projects and whether or not we're in any critical timing in terms of backfilling the funding?
I'm familiar with both projects. Both were deferred. We'll have to postpone the 2nd Radio Battalion building and the second project as well. Right now, not critical, but if they got pushed farther, then it would become a significant issue.
If I could get, just for the record, if I could get specific dates on when that really hits the critical path, I would appreciate it. Yes, then Secretary Spencer assured me that it wasn't a challenge now, but it could be. I'd like to know the specific timing. Thank you for that. Now I've got something that would be for Admiral Gilday and for you, General Berger, and maybe the Secretary is the tiebreaker. And it's the discussion we're having with FRC East, getting the funding to be best prepared for the F-35. We've got a bit of a stalemate there. We made some progress with the security fence, with the lift fan facility, but a lot of the infrastructure is sort of Navy-owned facility, Marine requirement. Every time I ask a question about who's going to actually own that and how we're going to get the funding, I get you need to talk to the Navy or you need to talk to the Marines. Do we have a definitive answer on that and where this sits on the priority list?
Sir, I can say that FRC is one of our three. It is part of the optimization plan that we have, and we're putting money against all three of those facilities right now. With respect to the potential finger pointing, I would like to get you a deeper brief on that. The Commandant and I, our staffs, can come together and if there is an issue, we will definitely resolve it.
That is you answered my question before I ask it. What I'd like to do, if we could, is just in a meeting, if we could get the stakeholders in the room and I can get a definitive readout, I would appreciate that. So I have your commitment to making sure that happens.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. General Berger, you mentioned about some of the review that you're doing for the acquisition programs review. What's the current status of that? When should we see a report out?
We're done the first part of it, Senator. Next step is for me to explain where we stand with the chair and ranking members of the 4 committees here, and I'll do that this weekend next if we can get through the scheduling part of that. After that, then we'll obviously go broader in terms of explaining the details. But it's important that I explain to those senior leaders in Congress first what the outcomes are. So we're done the first part.
Okay, thank you. Because my time is going to expire here fairly quickly, I'm going to submit some questions for the record about end strength, a few other questions that we'll just look forward to hearing back from you. In my remaining time, I'd like to talk about military housing. You know that we've spent a lot of time and effort to make sure, on the one hand, we were concerned with the nearly $40 million that's sliding to the right. On the other hand, we have succeeded in getting billions of dollars down to help with recovery. What's the status of that recovery? And specifically, how is the military housing situation? I'll let you know and everybody else that I'll be doing another town hall down there to hear directly from the military families. I think that's very helpful because for some strange reason, I announce it 6 weeks in advance. All the service requests tend to be done by the time I get there, but I'm hoping they're beginning to do it on a more consistent basis. So if I can get an update on both those projects, recovery with respect to Camp Lejeune broadly and then specifically for military housing.
Camp Lejeune broadly, first of all, the town halls you're spot on. I mean, unannounced is better, and you're going to get unfiltered kind of feedback from families, the way it should be, the way that we want them to be. So I thank you for that because it takes time. On the housing, there's about 520, give or take, empty family housing units at Camp Lejeune that the private partner owns. Some of them are repairable, some are not, and that's part of the discussion that goes on right now, not negotiation, but the dialogue between the department and the vendor about what to do about the 500 vacant houses. There's about 15 families, I think 15 right now, that remained in damaged homes at their choice. We offered to move them. They elected to stay there. The damage, in other words, from the hurricane was they were okay because they're going to move anyway, so they just stayed. So we're allowed them the choice either way. The funding for the last 2 tranches of supplementals, all of the, I think, $837 million from last year put on contract so far, I think about $157 million this year. We will be able to obligate all that you provided from the second tranche in this fiscal year. So I think by the end of this FY, both tranches will be fully under contract.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for your service. I wanted to just pick up on a point that Senator Perdue made a few minutes ago. He expressed some concern about hand-wringing over the budget and said, you know, I wish I'd seen concerns in the past when budgets were being cut. And look, to the extent that Congress has done bad things in budgets in the past, we need to own it. My first speech as a senator in February 2013 was a speech on the floor saying, we shouldn't do the sequester and budget caps. It's a bad idea. I think the reason there's hand-wringing now is that Congress has learned our lesson, and we're trying to do good budgets for the military, and what we're seeing is the drain of billions of dollars out of the budget for a non-military emergency at the southern border. Here's what we're doing within 1 year. Within the last year, the administration took first $6 billion, $3.5 from MILCON and $2.5 from other programs into the counter-drug fund to use for the wall. So that was $6 billion out of the DOD budget. They've announced, the administration has now announced another $3.8 billion that's being cannibalized out of various accounts put into the counter drug fund. So now that's $9.8 billion. And yesterday, Secretary Esper in the hearing announced that there will likely be another tranche taken from Milcon. It's been reported that would be 3.7, but just round it down, say that number's too high. It looks like the total within a year will be $13 billion, more than $1 billion a month, taken out of Congress's appropriated budget for your needs, for the nation's needs, to use for a non-military emergency that's not mentioned in the National Defense Strategy. Let me just put that into context. What does $13 billion mean to sea power, to our Navy and Marines? $13 billion, it's one carrier, or it's 4 Virginia-class subs. We're arguing about whether there should be a second sub this year. $13 billion bucks in a year is 4 subs. It's 6 destroyers. It's 4 amphibious assault ships. Secretary Hirono asked about the shipyard industrial optimization plan. That 20-year plan is $26 billion. So the $13 billion would be half of the 20-year plan to modernize our shipyards. Or the other way to look at it is when y'all submitted your budget this year, you submitted the amount of unfunded priorities you have. That total unfunded priority list for the DoD is $17 billion. $13 billion in 1 year taken for a non-military emergency when your total unfunded priority list is $17 billion. I'm going to state right now, if there's a Democratic president who tries to take money out of the DoD for a non-military emergency, I'm going to say, go get it through the appropriators. Don't ransack the Pentagon's budget for a non-military emergency. I stood up against Democratic or Republican presidents if I thought they were taking us to war without coming to Congress. I'm going to stand up against a Democratic president who tries to raid the Pentagon budget for non-military emergencies. You're here saying we're trying to be focused on the National Defense Strategy. It's a resource-tight environment. It's sort of hard to take that at face value when we're allowing $13 billion to walk out the door for a non-military emergency in 1 year. I want to offer you a compliment, General Berger. You made, I think, a challenging call, but the right call recently when you announced that Confederate paraphernalia would be removed from Marine bases as a just good order and discipline. I saw that announcement, and as a Virginian with a child in the Marines, I applaud that leadership move. Secretary Modly, I want to ask you to share a story that you shared with me with all my colleagues. Secretary Modly was in the Federated States of Micronesia recently, and this is a story about U.S. and China, what we're doing. Micronesia is a really important asset for us, where it is situated in the Pacific. Just share what's happening in terms of U.S. investment versus Chinese investment from your recent visit, if you would.
Sure, thanks for remembering the story. I was there about a year ago, and I made a trip through several Pacific islands. And I went to Micronesia and went to the far side of the island, and there was a Navy CB team there. Great group, 24 CBs, building a school for the local citizens there. Very traditional construction, concrete pilings, corrugated steel roof, plywood sides, making great relationships with the locals. As you leave this facility and you drive down the street, there's a big sign, Micronesian Agricultural Center, being paid for and built by the People's Republic of China. And it just gave me the impression that in some of these areas where we have traditional long-term friendships with these nations who want us to be their partners, and we're playing small ball.
We removed all Peace Corps volunteers from Micronesia in 2017 and from Palau.
Yes, sir. And in the embassy building there, I saw a bunch of signs for the old Peace Corps, and I said, "Why are these here?" They said, "Well, we shut down the Peace Corps here," and they had been there since the beginning of the Peace Corps. And people in Micronesia know Americans because of the Peace Corps. So it may not extend to the entire Pacific region, but it was an example to me of particularly how we need to step up our involvement there, and not just militarily, but in other ways.
Thanks for sharing that story. Thanks, Mr. Chair.